Hello everyone, welcome Lead School at Home. We have started third chapter of history in unit 4, that is the making of a global world. In that we have studied the first point, the pre-modern world. In that we have studied silk routes link the world, then food travels, spaghetti and potato, then conquest, disease and trade. Then we have studied second point, that is the 19th century started from 1815 to 1914. In that we have studied world economic take shape, then role of technology, then late 19th century colonialism, then rinderpest or the cattle plague. Then we have studied about endangered labor migration from India, then Indian entrepreneurs abroad. Now we will start with the next point, that is 2.6, Indian trade, colonialism and the global system. Please student, put your textbook in front of you while watching this video and be ready with your pen, pencil and notebook. Historically, fine cottons produced in India were exported to Europe. Fine cottons which produced in India were exported to Europe. With industrialization, British cotton manufacturer began to expand, and industrialists pressurized the government to restrict cotton imports and protect local industries. With industrialization, British cotton manufacturer began to expand, as well as the industrialists pressurized on the government to restrict cotton imports and protect local industries. Tariffs were imposed on cloth imports into Britain. Tariffs were imposed on cloth imports to Britain. Consequently, the inflow of fine Indian cotton began to decline, and as a result, the flow of fine Indian cotton began to decline. From the early 19th century, British manufacturers also began to seek overseas market for their clothes. And in the early 19th century, British manufacturers are also began to seek overseas market for their clothes. Excluded from the British. Now we will move on to the next page. On this page, one figure is there, that is figure number 17, East India Company House at London. This was the nerve center of the worldwide operations of the East India Company. Now we will move on to the paragraph. Market also tariff barriers. Indian textiles now faced stiff competition in other international markets. Market by tariff barriers. Indian textiles now faced stiff competition in other international markets. If we look at the figures of exports from India, we see a steady decline of the share of cotton textiles. If we see the figures of export from India, that see decline of share of cotton textiles from some 30% around 18th century to 15% by 1815, and that declination in the year 18th century, that is 30%, and in the year 1815 it's 15%. By the 1870s this proportion had dropped to below 3%, and in the year 1870s this proportion had dropped by 3%. What then did Indian export? Question is there. See the answer. The figures again tell a dramatic story. While exports of manufacturers declined rapidly, exports of raw materials increased equally fast. Exports of manufacturers declined rapidly. Exports of raw materials increased equally fast. Between 1812 and 1871, the share of raw cotton exports rose from 5% to 35%. Now, share of cotton exports rose in the year 1812 to 1871 by 5% to 35%. Indigo, used for dyeing cloth, was another important export for many decades, and after that arose in market. Indigo, used for dyeing clothes, was another important export for many decades. Now we will move towards on the next page. Before going towards on the next page, see one figure has given, that is figure number 18, a distant view of Surat and its river. See the explanation here. All through the 17th and early 18th centuries, Surat remained the main center of overseas trade in the Western Indian Ocean. Now we will move on towards the next page. And as you have read last year, opium shipments to China grew rapidly from the 1820s to become for a while India's single largest export. After the cotton and indigo, opium shipment to China grew rapidly from the year 1820s to become for a while India's single largest export. Britain grew opium in India and exported it to China, and with the money earned through this sale, it financed its tea and other imports from China. Britain grew opium in India and exported to China. With the money earned through this sale, it financed its tea and other imports from China. Now we will move towards the next paragraph. Over the 19th century, British manufacturers flooded the Indian market. Means over the 19th century, British manufacturer flooded the Indian market. Food, grain and raw material exports from India to Britain and the rest of the world increased. Food grain as well as raw material export from India to Britain, and as a result the rest of the world increased. But the value of British exports to India was much higher than the value of British imports from India. But the value of British exports to India was much higher than the value of British imports from India. Thus, Britain had a trade surplus with India, and as a result, Britain had a trade surplus with India. Britain used this surplus to balance its trade deficit with other countries, and Britain used this surplus to balance its trade deficit with other countries, that is, with the countries from which Britain was importing more than it was selling to, and that was with the countries from which Britain was importing more than it was selling to. This is how a multilateral settlement system works, and in this way, how a multilateral settlement system works, it allows one country's deficit to another country to be settled by its surplus with a third country. And the system in this way, it allows one country's deficit to another country to be settled by its surplus with a third country. By helping British balance its deficit, India played a crucial role in the late 19th century world economy. And by helping Britain balance its deficit, India played an important role in the late 19th century in world economy. Now we will move on towards the next paragraph. In this paragraph, we will see Britain's trade surplus in India also helped pay the so-called home charges. Britain's trade surplus in India also helped to pay the so-called home charges that included private remittances home by British officials and trades, interest payments on India's external debt and pensions of British officials in India, and using that home charges that included private remittances home by British officials and trades, interest payment on India's external debt and pensions of British officials in India. Now, one picture has given. Let's see what is the picture of that. Below that description has given, that is figure number 19, the trade routes that linked India to the world at the end of the 17th century. This is the route linked India to the world at the end of 17th century. See here, India is there at the center, and how the sea route and land routes has shown how other words join to the India. Now we will move on towards the next page. On this page, new point is there, that is number third, the interwar economy. The First World War started from 1914 and it's ended on 1918, was mainly fought in Europe, but its impact was felt around the world. Notably, for our concerns, in this chapter, it plunged the first half of the 20th century into a crisis that took over 3 decades to overcome. In this chapter, it plunged. Now, meaning of plunged means to thirst violently. The first half of the 20th century into a crisis that took over 3 decades to overcome. During this period, the world experienced widespread economic and political instability and another catastrophic war. Now, meaning of catastrophic means sudden calamity. Sudden calamity. Here, now, next point is there in interwar economy, that is 3.1, wartime transformation. The First World War, as you know, was fought between two power blocks. Means this World War, which was started from 1914 and it's ended on 1918, was fought between two powers. On the one side were the Allies, Britain, France, and Russia, and after some days later joined by the US. And on the opposite side were the Central Powers, that is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Ottoman Turkey. There are two sides are there. First, Allies Britain, France, and Russia, and after some days joined by the US against Central Powers. Those are Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Ottoman Turkey. When the war began in August 1914, many governments thought it would be over by Christmas. It lasted more than 4 years. Means when the war began in August 1914, many governments thought that it would be over by Christmas on that year. But it has taken a long year, near about 4 years. Now we will move towards on the next paragraph. The First World War was a war like no other before, and the First World War was a war like no other war before happened. The fighting involved the world's leading industrial nations, which now harnessed the vast powers of modern industry to inflict the greatest possible destruction on their enemies. Means the fighting involved the world's leading industrial nations, which now harnessed. Now, meaning of harnessed means to work in double. the vast powers of a modern industry in to inflict. Now meaning of inflict means to cause, to suffer. The greatest possible destruction. Now meaning of destruction means destroying or being destroyed on their enemies. Now we will move towards on the next paragraph. This war was thus the first modern industrial war. It was the use of machine guns, tanks, aircraft, then chemical weapons, etc. In the war used machine guns, tanks, aircraft, chemical weapons, etc. on massive scale, means on large scale. These were all increasingly products of a modern large scale industry. To fight the war, millions of soldiers had to be recruited from around the world and moved to the front lines on large ships and trains. In that war, where all increasingly products of a modern large-scale industry were used, and for that war, millions of soldiers had to be recruited around the world and moved to front line on large ships and trains. The scale of death and destruction: 9 millions dead and 20 millions injured. And in this war, near about 9 million people were died and 20 million people were injured, was unthinkable before the industrial age without the use of industrial arms. Now we will move towards on the next paragraph. Most of the killed and maimed were men of a working age. Most people were killed and maimed were men of a working age. Now here the meaning of maimed means to cripple. These deaths and injuries reduced the able-bodied workforce in Europe, and these deaths and injuries reduced able-bodied workforce in Europe. With fewer numbers within the family, household incomes declined after the war. With the fewer number within the family, household incomes declined after the war. Now, next paragraph. During the war, industries were restricted to produce war-related goods, and during the war, industries were restricted to produce war-related goods. Entire societies were also recognized for war. As men went to battle, women stepped in to undertake jobs that earlier only men were expected to do. Entire societies were also recognized for war. As men went to battle, women stepped in to undertake jobs that earlier only men were expected to do. Now we will move on towards the next page. While moving on to the next page, here one figure has given, that is figure number 20. Workers in the munition factory during the First World War. Production of armaments increased rapidly to meet war demands. Now we will move towards on the next page. The war led to the snapping of economic links between some of the world's largest economic powers, which were now fighting each other to pay for them. The war led to the snapping of economic links between some of the world's largest economic powers, which were now fighting each other for to paying for them. So Britain borrowed large sums of money from US banks as well as the US public, and as a result Britain borrowed money from US banks as well as the US public. Thus, the war transformed the US from being an international debater to an international creditor. In other words, at the war's end, the US and its citizens owned more overseas assets than foreign governments and citizens own in the US, and as In the other words, at the war's end, the US and its citizens own more overseas assets than foreign governments and citizens own in the US.